My relatives started making fun of me when they found out I inherited nothing but an old dog. Soon after, they took me to court once they discovered what that dog was hiding. Let me explain how it all went down. I never thought it would come to this. Fighting over a dog. After Grandma's funeral, we all gathered at her house in Springfield, Missouri. The house felt smaller somehow, like all the life had been sucked out of it. We were sitting in her living room, the same room where she used to watch her soap operas and complain about the neighbors. Now it was just us, Dad, Uncle Mike, Aunt Carol, and me, waiting for the notary to make everything official. When the notary read the will, everything was crystal clear. The house and main assets were divided between Dad, Uncle Mike, and Aunt Carol. The house was worth about $300,000. Plus there was her savings account, some old bonds, and a few other things. Me, the grandson who visited her most, got nothing. Just one sentence buried at the end. And let Barkley stay with Jake. He knows why. Barkley was Grandma's old Labrador, 12 years old, gray around the muzzle, and suffering from arthritis that made him walk like he was perpetually climbing invisible stairs. The moment those words were read, Aunt Carol snorted and said something like, "Well, there's your inheritance, Jake. A dog with arthritis, and probably about 6 months left to live." That comment stung more than I expected. Uncle Mike chuckled and patted me on the shoulder, telling me not to worry about it. That dogs were expensive anyway, and I was probably better off. I felt my face getting hot. These people had no idea what they were talking about. I took the dog and left, despite Dad asking me not to pour gasoline on the fire. He was trying to keep the peace, but I could see in his eyes that he was secretly relieved he didn't have to share his portion with me. The thing that really got to me was the hypocrisy of it all. I'd visited Grandma more than any of them combined. When her arthritis got bad 3 years ago, I was the one helping her around the house every weekend. I was the one taking Barkley on his walks when she couldn't manage it anymore. I was the one who drove her to doctor appointments because she was too proud to ask anyone else for help. Uncle Mike lived 40 minutes away and visited maybe once a month. Aunt Carol lived in the same town, but always had excuses about why she couldn't stop by. Dad visited regularly, but he was always talking about work or complaining about his own problems. I actually listened to Grandma's stories about her childhood, about Grandpa, about the neighborhood gossip that somehow mattered to her. But legally speaking, I formally inherited nothing except a 12-year-old dog, and I had zero grounds to claim anything more. The will was straightforward, signed and witnessed properly. There was no ambiguity about the division of assets. No one had promised me anything over the years. I had nothing to stand on except my own sense of fairness, which apparently wasn't worth much in legal terms. The drive home with Barkley was awkward as hell. This old dog sitting in my passenger seat, panting and looking confused about why we weren't going back to the house he'd known for 12 years. I lived in a tiny apartment near the university, definitely not dog-friendly. My landlord was going to flip when he saw I brought home a 70-pound lab who wasn't exactly quiet about his bathroom needs. I kept thinking about that weird phrase in the will. He knows why. What did I know? I knew Barkley liked tennis balls and hated thunderstorms. I knew he had a weird habit of hoarding socks under Grandma's bed. I knew he could open doors if they weren't latched properly. I knew he got excited whenever someone said the word walk, and that he would steal food off your plate if you turned your back for 2 seconds. But what was so special about that knowledge that it warranted a mention in a legal document? Grandma wasn't sentimental about pets. She was practical about everything. When her cat died a few years back, she didn't get another one. She said the house was too quiet. But she didn't replace him. She wasn't the type to get emotional about animals. The family drama didn't stop at the reading of the will. Uncle Mike called me the next day to suggest I might want to reconsider keeping the dog. He said he and his wife had been talking, and they'd be willing to take Barkley off my hands. Real generous of him, considering he'd never shown any interest in the dog before. Aunt Carol was even more direct. She sent me links to local animal shelters and suggested I be doing everyone a favor by surrendering him. Dad tried to stay neutral, which was his signature move in family conflicts. He'd call and ask how I was doing, But I could tell he was really calling to make sure I wasn't going to cause any trouble about the will. He kept saying things like, Grandma loved you, and sometimes these things just work out the way they work out. The first few nights were rough. Barkley kept pacing around my apartment, whining softly. He'd go to the door and just stand there, like he was waiting for Grandma to come pick him up. I felt like I was housing a refugee from his own life. My neighbors weren't thrilled about the situation either. Mrs. Peterson from downstairs knocked on my door twice to complain about the dog walking around at night. I started questioning everything. Maybe the family was right. Maybe I was just being stubborn about keeping this dog when I clearly wasn't equipped for it. My savings account was already pathetic, and now I had vet bills and dog food to worry about. Plus, I was supposed to be focusing on my senior year, not playing dog sitter to a geriatric lab. But something kept nagging at me about the whole situation. Grandma never did anything without a reason. Even when I was a kid, she'd give me weird little gifts that didn't make sense until years later. Like when she gave me a snow shovel for my 10th birthday. I thought it was the dumbest present ever until we got hit with that massive blizzard in February, and I was the only kid on the block who could dig out our driveway. Or the time she gave me a book about investing when I was 15. I thought it was boring and stuck it on my shelf. 2 years later, when I was applying for college and needed to understand financial aid, that book helped me figure out how to make my money work better. She always seemed to know what I'd need before I knew I needed it. So maybe there was something I was missing about Barkley. Maybe that cryptic line in the will wasn't just about giving me a pet to remember her by. Maybe there was something else. Something that would make sense of why she'd been so specific about me being the one to take him. I started paying closer attention to everything the dog did, looking for clues about what she might have meant. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I was probably overthinking the whole thing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than anyone realized. The first few days after moving Barkley into my apartment were rough on both of us. He kept pacing around like he was looking for something, whining at random times, and generally acting like a dog who'd lost his purpose in life. I figured it was just grief. Dogs can sense when their owners are gone, right? But this felt different, more urgent. It started on the third night. I was trying to study for my economics final when Barkley jumped up on the couch next to me and started scratching at his collar. Not the usual scratching you'd expect from a dog. This was deliberate, almost frantic. He kept pawing at the same spot on the old leather collar, over and over again. At first, I thought maybe the collar was too tight or irritating his skin. The thing was ancient, probably older than I was. The leather was worn smooth and dark from years of wear, and had that old dog smell that you can never quite get rid of. But when I checked, it wasn't too tight. He had plenty of room to breathe. The scratching continued for 2 more days. Every time I'd sit down, Barkley would come over and start pawing at that collar. It was driving me crazy. I'd push his paw away, and he'd immediately go back to the same spot. It was like he was trying to tell me something, but I was too dense to understand dog language. Finally, on Saturday morning, I'd had enough. I decided to take the collar off and give him a break from it. Maybe it was just old and uncomfortable, and he needed a new one. I could afford a $20 collar, even if I couldn't afford much else these days. But when I started to unbuckle it, I noticed something weird. There was a small bulge in the padding, right where he'd been scratching. The leather on the outside looked normal, but when I pressed on it, I could feel something hard underneath, something that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. My heart started racing. This had to be what Grandma meant by "he knows why." She'd hidden something in the dog's collar, and somehow Barkley knew it was there. Dogs are smart, but they're not that smart, unless she trained him to show me where it was. I took the collar to my kitchen table and examined it under the bright overhead light. The stitching along one edge looked different from the rest, newer, like it had been opened and sewn back up. I got a small knife and carefully cut the thread, trying not to damage whatever was inside. The padding peeled back easily, revealing a small pocket that had been sewn into the collar. Inside were 2 things that made my hands shake as I pulled them out. A tiny key with Bank of America engraved on it, and a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been torn from a notebook. The paper was covered in Grandma's handwriting, the same careful script she'd used to write birthday cards and grocery lists. The message was short but clear. Jake, if you're reading this, I'm not with you anymore. This key opens my safety deposit box in Springfield. I trust you. Don't trust the others. I sat there staring at the note for a long time. A safety deposit box? Grandma had never mentioned having one. In all the years I'd known her, she never talked about keeping anything in a bank except her checking account. She was the type of person who kept important papers in a shoebox under her bed and hid emergency cash in coffee cans. But here was proof that she'd been more prepared than anyone realized. The key felt substantial in my hand, not like some cheap copy. This was the real deal. My first instinct was to call Dad and tell him what I'd found. But then I remembered the note. Don't trust the others. The others had to mean the family. The same people who'd been making jokes about my inheritance and suggesting I get rid of the dog. I spent the rest of the weekend researching safety deposit boxes online, trying to figure out what the process would be like. Legally, I had no rights to Grandma's box. I wasn't listed as an authorized user, and the will didn't mention it. But I had her handwritten note and the key, which had to count for something. The more I thought about it, the more nervous I became. What if this was some kind of test? What if there was nothing in the box, and Grandma just wanted to see if I'd be honest about finding the key? Or worse, what if there was something in there that would get me in trouble? But I couldn't let it go. The curiosity was eating me alive. On Monday morning, I skipped my first class and drove to Bank of America branch in downtown Springfield. I'd been there a few times with Grandma when she needed to make deposits, so I knew where it was. The bank was busy, full of people doing their Monday morning banking. I waited in line for 20 minutes, rehearsing what I was going to say. When I finally got to the teller, I must have looked nervous as hell, because she asked if I was okay before I even said anything. I explained that my grandmother had passed away and left me a key to her safety deposit box. I showed her the key and the handwritten note. She looked at both carefully, then called over a manager. The manager was a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, who remembered Grandma from her regular visits. She looked at the note and the key, then asked me to wait while she made some phone calls. I sat in the waiting area for what felt like hours, watching other customers come and go. Finally, Mrs. Rodriguez came back with a sympathetic expression. She explained that while I couldn't access the box immediately, the handwritten note and key were enough to petition the court for temporary access. She said it would take about a week to get the paperwork processed, but she'd seen similar cases before. The whole process felt surreal. I filled out forms, provided identification, and gave them copies of Grandma's death certificate and the will. Mrs. Rodriguez was helpful and patient, walking me through each step. She even mentioned that Grandma had been very specific about the instructions she'd left regarding the box. Apparently, Grandma had told the bank that if anything happened to her, someone would come with a handwritten note and a key. She described me perfectly, down to the scar on my left hand from when I'd helped her fix her fence a few years ago. The bank had been expecting me, even if I hadn't been expecting this. The waiting period was torture. I couldn't concentrate on my classes, couldn't sleep properly, and couldn't stop thinking about what might be in that box. Every time my phone rang, I hoped it was a bank calling to tell me the paperwork had been approved. Barkley seemed more relaxed after I'd removed the collar. He stopped pacing around the apartment and started acting more like his old self. It was like he completed his mission and could finally rest. I bought him a new collar, a simple blue one that actually fit him properly. The family kept calling to check on me, but I didn't mention anything about the key or the safety deposit box. Dad asked how I was handling the responsibility of pet ownership, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice. Uncle Mike called to offer again to take Barkley off my hands, saying he'd found a great farm where the dog could run around freely. Aunt Carol was the most persistent. She kept suggesting that I was being selfish by keeping an old dog in a small apartment. She even offered to pay for a nice kennel where he could be more comfortable. Every conversation felt like an interrogation about my plans and my finances. But I kept thinking about Grandma's note. Don't trust the others. Maybe she'd known that the family would try to pressure me into giving up the dog. Maybe she'd planned for this exact scenario. 11 days after my initial visit to the bank, Mrs. Rodriguez called. The court had approved temporary access to the safety deposit box. I could come in that afternoon to open it, but I'd need to bring a witness, and someone from the bank would have to be present to document everything inside. I drove to the bank with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. This was it. In a few hours, I'd know what Grandma had been hiding all these years. The key felt heavy in my pocket, like it carried the weight of all her secrets. As I walked into the bank, I couldn't help but wonder if the family had any idea what they'd missed. They'd been so focused on dividing up the obvious assets that they'd never considered what else might be out there. They dismissed me as the kid who got stuck with a dog, not realizing that the dog was the key to everything else. Whatever was in that box, I had a feeling it was going to change everything. Box number 114 was located in the basement of the Bank of America building, behind a heavy steel door that required 2 keys to open. Mrs. Rodriguez led me down a narrow hallway lined with identical metal boxes, each one hiding someone's most precious possessions. The witness they brought was a notary public named Mr.Njor, who looked like he'd been doing this job for about 30 years. The moment of truth arrived faster than I expected. Mrs. Rodriguez inserted the bank's master key, then handed me Grandma's key. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped it. The key slid into the lock smoothly, like it had been waiting for this moment. When both keys turned, there was a satisfying click that echoed off the concrete walls. The box was deeper than I'd expected, about the size of a large shoebox. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled it out and set on a small table in the corner of the room. She explained that I could look through everything, but she'd need to document each item for the court records. Mr. Chen opened his notebook and prepared to witness whatever we found. I lifted the lid with trembling hands, and what I saw inside made my knees weak. This wasn't just some sentimental collection of family photos and old jewelry. This was serious money. Real assets that nobody in the family had even suspected existed. The first item was an original stock certificate for Walmart Incorporated, dated 1987. The certificate was in pristine condition, protected by a plastic sleeve. It was made out to Dorothy Mae Henderson, Grandma's full name, for 1,000 shares. I had to read it 3 times before the number sank in. 5,000 shares of Walmart stock, purchased when the company was still relatively small. Mrs. Rodriguez whistled softly when she saw it. She asked if I had any idea what those shares would be worth today. I didn't, but I could tell from her expression that it was a lot more than anyone in the family had imagined Grandma could afford. The second item was a letter from a law firm in Kansas City, dated 1991. The letterhead was fancy, the kind of stationery that costs more than most people spend on groceries. The letter was addressed to Grandma and referenced the establishment of a trust account in the event of your husband's death. It mentioned specific conditions and beneficiaries, but the language was so full of legal jargon that I could barely understand it. What I could understand was that Grandma had been planning for this scenario for over 30 years. She'd set up some kind of trust that was completely separate from a regular will. The letter referenced conditional distributions and specific triggering events that would activate the trust. Mr. Chen was taking notes furiously, documenting every detail. He'd seen a lot of safety deposit boxes in his career, but I could tell this one was unusual. Most people keep family documents and maybe some jewelry in these boxes. This looked more like a business transaction. The third item was another key, this one larger and older than the bank key. It was attached to a small metal tag with an address written in Grandma's handwriting, 1247 Elm Street, rear basement. I recognized the address immediately. It was the old house where Grandma had lived with Grandpa before they'd moved to the house we all knew. The property had been sold years ago, or so we thought. Mrs. Rodriguez asked if I knew what the key was for. I had no idea, but the address was burned into my memory. Grandma had mentioned that old house sometimes, usually when she was telling stories about the early days of her marriage. She'd always seemed nostalgic about it, but I'd never thought much about why. The idea that she might still have some connection to that property was mind-blowing. The family had assumed she'd sold it and used the money for living expenses. But what if she'd never actually sold it? What if she'd been keeping it as some kind of secret asset? At the bottom of the box were several old photographs, the kind with white borders and slightly faded colors. Most of them showed Grandma and Grandpa when they were young, standing in front of various houses and cars. But one photo caught my attention immediately. It showed the two of them standing in front of a small house with the address 1247 Elm Street clearly visible on the mailbox. On the back of the photo, in Grandma's careful handwriting, was a note: "Our first home, 1963. Never forgot where we started." The date was significant. 1963 was the year they'd gotten married. This must have been their first house together, the place where they'd started their life as a couple. But why would she keep a key to a house she'd supposedly sold decades ago? And why would she hide it in a safety deposit box along with stock certificates and legal documents? The more I thought about it, the more I realized there was still another layer to this mystery. I gathered all the documents and asked Mrs. Rodriguez if I could take them to a lawyer. She explained that since the court had granted me temporary access, I could take copies of everything, but the originals would need to stay in the box until the estate was fully settled. Mr. Chin made copies of each document, and I signed forms acknowledging that I'd received them. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. I kept thinking about those stock certificates and what they might be worth. Walmart had been one of the most successful companies in American history. If Grandma had bought those shares in 1987 and held on to them for 30-plus years, they could be worth a fortune. I called the law firm that had handled Grandma's estate and made an appointment to see them the next day. The receptionist asked what was regarding, and I told her I'd found some documents that might be relevant to the estate. She said the lawyer could fit me in at 2 p.m. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept looking at the copies of the documents, trying to make sense of the legal language. The trust document was particularly confusing, full of terms like conditional beneficiary and triggering event compliance. But one phrase kept jumping out at me: upon acceptance of care responsibilities for designated companion animal. Barkley was sleeping peacefully at the foot of my bed, completely oblivious to the chaos he'd set in motion. The dog that everyone thought was worthless had turned out to be the key to a treasure hunt that Grandma had been planning for decades. She'd known that whoever cared enough to keep the dog would be the one who deserved whatever she'd hidden. I started doing math in my head, trying to estimate what those Walmart shares might be worth. The stock had split several times over the years, so those original 5,000 shares would have multiplied. Even conservatively, they had to be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. The next morning, I met with Robert Martinez, the lawyer who'd handled Grandma's estate. He was a middle-aged guy with a reputation for being thorough and honest. When I showed him the documents, his expression changed from polite interest to genuine surprise. He examined the stock certificate carefully, then looked up the current value of Walmart stock on his computer. When he turned the screen toward me, I nearly fell out of my chair. Those 5,000 shares, after splits and dividends, were now worth approximately 20,000 shares at current market prices. At roughly $100 per share, the total value was close to $2 million. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Mr. Martinez explained that the trust document I'd found was completely separate from the will that had been probated. The trust had specific conditions that had to be met for it to be activated, and taking care of Barkley was apparently one of those conditions. According to the trust document, Grandma had established what's called a conditional living trust in 1991. The trust was designed to remain dormant until specific conditions were met. The primary condition was that the designated beneficiary would accept responsibility for the care and welfare of the grantor's companion animal following the grantor's death. In simpler terms, the trust would only activate if someone took care of Barkley after Grandma died. And since I was the only one who'd been willing to keep the dog, I was the only one who could claim the trust assets. The stock certificates weren't part of the regular estate because they'd been placed in the trust years before Grandma died. Mr. Martinez said he'd seen similar arrangements before, but never one quite this elaborate. Grandma had essentially created a test to determine who in the family truly cared about her wishes. The person who was willing to take care of her dog would be the person who received her most valuable assets. But there was still the matter of the mysterious key and the address on Elm Street. Mr. Martinez agreed to help me research the property records for that address. If Grandma still owned that property or had some legal interest in it, that would be another asset that hadn't been accounted for in this state. As I left the lawyer's office, I couldn't help but smile. The family had been so focused on the obvious assets, the house, the savings account, the bonds, that they'd never even considered what else might be out there. They dismissed me as a kid who got stuck with a dog, not realizing that the dog was the key to a fortune. But I still had one more mystery to solve. What was behind the door at 1247 Elm Street, and why had Grandma kept a key to a house she'd supposedly sold decades ago? Something told me the biggest surprise was still waiting to be discovered. The thought of what I might find at that address made my heart race. If the safety deposit box had contained nearly $2 million in stock certificates, what could be hidden in a house that no one in the family even knew existed? The family found out about my discovery faster than I expected. I should have known that news travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves the Bank of America and court documents. Mrs. Rodriguez must have mentioned something to someone, or maybe the court clerk gossiped about the unusual case. Either way, by Thursday morning, my phone was ringing off the hook. Aunt Carol called first, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. She demanded to know what I was hiding and why I hadn't told the family about finding documents in the dog's collar. When I tried to explain about the trust and the stock certificates, she cut me off and said she was calling her lawyer immediately. Dad called next, try and play peacemaker as usual. He asked me to be reasonable and suggested we all sit down together to discuss the situation. He said the family was just concerned about making sure everything was handled properly, but I could hear the disappointment in his voice. The disappointment that his son might actually have inherited something valuable. Uncle Mike was the most direct. He called me that evening and flat out accused me of stealing from the estate. He said I had no right to go digging around in safety deposit boxes without telling the other beneficiaries. When I pointed out that the box wasn't mentioned in the will, he said that was exactly the problem. I was taking things that belonged to the whole family. I tried to explain about the trust and how it worked, but he wasn't interested in hearing about legal technicalities. He kept saying that Grandma wouldn't have wanted me to keep such a large inheritance, while everyone else got so little. He said I was being selfish and that the family was going to fight me on this. By Friday, I had a formal legal notice in my mailbox. Aunt Carol had filed a petition with the probate court, claiming that I had unlawfully removed assets from the estate. The petition stated that I had willfully concealed material assets and had acted in bad faith by not disclosing the safety deposit box to the other beneficiaries. Mr. Martinez wasn't surprised when I showed him the legal notice. He said these kinds of family disputes were common when hidden assets were discovered after an estate had been settled. The fact that I had found the trust documents didn't automatically mean I was entitled to the assets. The court would have to determine whether the trust was valid and whether I had met the conditions properly. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Mr. Martinez explained that both sides would present their arguments, and the judge would decide whether the trust was legitimate and whether I had rightful claim to the assets. He warned me that family disputes over inheritances could get ugly, and I should be prepared for some harsh words from my relatives. What I wasn't prepared for was how personal they'd make it. When we arrived at the courthouse, the whole family was there: Dad, Uncle Mike, Aunt Carol, and even some cousins I hadn't seen in years. They were all sitting together on one side of the courtroom, whispering among themselves and shooting dirty looks in my direction. Aunt Carol's lawyer was a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia Stone, who clearly specialized in estate disputes. She stood up first and argued that the trust was invalid because it had been created without proper disclosure to the family. She claimed that Grandma had been suffering from diminished mental capacity when she'd set up the trust, and that I had taken advantage of an elderly woman. She also argued that the condition about taking care of Barkley was too vague to be legally enforceable. According to her interpretation, the trust should be dissolved and the assets should be distributed according to the original will. That would mean splitting the stock certificates 3 ways between Dad, Uncle Mike, and Aunt Carol. The personal attacks started when she questioned my motives for keeping the dog. She suggested that I had somehow known about the hidden assets and had manipulated Grandma into giving me the dog as a way to access them. She painted me as a scheming grandson who had taken advantage of his grandmother's loneliness and confusion. Mr. Martinez stood up to present our side of the case. He had copies of all the trust documents, including the original paperwork from 1991 that showed the trust had been established decades before Grandma's death. He also had testimony from the bank employees who had helped set up the safety deposit box, proving that Grandma had been mentally sharp when she'd made these arrangements. The key piece of evidence was a handwritten note that had been hidden in Barkley's collar. Mr. Martinez argued that this note proved Grandma's intent. She had specifically chosen me to receive the trust assets, and she had created an elaborate system to ensure that only someone who truly cared about her wishes would find them. He also presented evidence that I had been the family member who had spent the most time with Grandma in her final years. Bank records showed that I had often driven her to appointments and had been present during many of her financial transactions. This contradicted the claim that I had somehow manipulated her. The judge asked several pointed questions about the validity of the trust and whether the conditions had been properly met. She wanted to know why Grandma had chosen such an unusual method of transferring assets, and whether there was any evidence of coercion or undue influence. Mr. Martinez explained that conditional trusts were not uncommon, especially when the grantor wanted to ensure that assets went to someone who would honor their wishes. He pointed out that Grandma had been very specific about the conditions. The beneficiary had to accept responsibility for the dog, and they had to find the hidden instructions on their own. The judge also questioned the family's claim that they had been unaware of the trust. She pointed out that the trust had been established in 1991, more than 30 years before Grandma's death. If the family had been more involved in her financial affairs, they might have discovered it earlier. Dad was called as a witness, and I could see how uncomfortable he was with the whole situation. When asked about his relationship with Grandma, he admitted that he hadn't visited her as regularly as he should have. He also acknowledged that I had been the one who had helped her with day-to-day tasks and had been present during her final illness. Uncle Mike was more combative when he testified. He insisted that the family had always been close and that Grandma wouldn't have wanted to create divisions among her children and grandchildren. But when the judge asked him when he had last visited Grandma before her death, he had to admit it had been several months. Aunt Carol was the most emotional witness. She broke down crying when she talked about feeling betrayed by both Grandma and me. She said she couldn't understand why her mother would have hidden such valuable assets from her own children. But her testimony also revealed that she had been planning to sell Grandma's house immediately after the funeral, which contradicted her claims about wanting to preserve family unity. The judge took a recess to review all the evidence and testimony. Mr. Martinez seemed confident about our case, but he warned me that family court judges sometimes try to find compromises that would satisfy everyone. He said there was a chance the judge might order the trust assets to be split among all the beneficiaries, regardless of the original conditions. When court reconvened, the judge delivered her decision. She ruled that the trust was valid and had been properly established. She found that Grandma had been mentally competent when she created the trust and that there was no evidence of coercion or undue influence. Most importantly, she ruled that I had met all the conditions required to activate the trust. The judge explained that conditional trusts were designed to ensure that assets went to beneficiaries who would honor the grantor's wishes. The fact that I had been willing to take care of Barkley, despite the financial burden and family pressure, proved that I was the intended beneficiary. The stock certificates were officially transferred to my name, along with all the dividends and splits that had accumulated over the years. The total value was $1,923,000, which was more money than I had ever imagined possible. But the judge also noted that there was still the matter of the mysterious key and the Elm Street address, which would require separate legal proceedings. As we left the courthouse, the family was furious. Aunt Carol was crying and saying she couldn't believe her own mother would have done this to her. Uncle Mike was threatening to appeal the decision, though Mr. Martinez assured me that their grounds for appeal were weak. Dad was the only one who seemed conflicted. He pulled me aside and said he was happy that I'd inherited something substantial, but he was worried about what this would do to our family relationships. He asked me to consider sharing some of the money with the others, just to keep the peace. But I remembered Grandma's note, "Don't trust the others." She had known this would happen. She had known that the family would try to pressure me into giving up what was rightfully mine. The fact that they were more concerned about money than about honoring her wishes proved that she had made the right choice. I still had one more mystery to solve, though: the key to 1247. Elm Street was burning a hole in my pocket. If the safety deposit box had contained nearly $2 million in stock certificates, what could be hidden in a house that no one in the family even knew existed? As I drove home that evening, I couldn't help but think about how different my life had become in just a few weeks. A month ago, I was a broke college student whose biggest worry was paying rent. Now, I was a millionaire with a family that would probably never speak to me again. But I also had Barkley, who was still wagging his tail and acting like nothing had changed. Maybe that was the point. Maybe Grandma had wanted to find the one person in the family who would value loyalty over money. The person who would keep a promise, even when it seemed pointless. The person who would take care of an old dog just because it was the right thing to do. The address on the key tag led me to a part of Springfield I hadn't visited in years. 1247 Elm Street was in an older neighborhood where the houses were small and close together, the kind of place where young couples bought their first homes in the 1960s. I drove past the address twice before I realized I was looking at the right house. The property looked abandoned. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the windows were boarded up with plywood. A for sale sign in the front yard was so weathered and faded that I could barely read the phone number. It looked like the kind of place that had been sitting empty for years, waiting for someone to either buy it or tear it down. But tucked away behind the house was a small structure that looked like it might have been a workshop or storage shed. The key tag had said rear basement, and I realized that this building might be what Grandma had been referring to. It was barely visible from the street, hidden behind overgrown bushes and a chain-link fence. I parked on the street and walked around to the back of the property. The shed was in better condition than the main house, with a newer roof and what looked like a recently installed security door. Someone had been maintaining this building, even while letting the rest of the property deteriorate. The key from the safety deposit box fit perfectly into the lock on the security door. Inside, I found a narrow staircase leading down to what appeared to be a basement that had been carved out under the shed. The walls were concrete, and there was a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. It looked like something from a movie about secret hideouts. At the bottom of the stairs, built into the concrete floor, was a large safe. It was the old-fashioned kind, with a heavy steel door and a combination lock. But there was also a keyhole, and I had a feeling that the second key from the safety deposit box would fit perfectly. I was right. The key turned smoothly, and the safe door swung open with a satisfying click. What I found inside made the stock certificates look like pocket change. There were stacks of cash, neatly bundled and wrapped in plastic. Old bills, but not so old that they'd be worthless. I counted $37,000 in cash, all of it accounted for with handwritten ledgers that tracked every deposit and withdrawal. But the cash wasn't the most interesting part. There was also a collection of silver coins, all from the 1920s and 1930s, carefully stored in protective cases. Some of them looked like they were in mint condition, the kind of coins that collectors would pay premium prices for. I had no idea what they were worth, but they looked valuable. At the bottom of the safe was another handwritten note from Grandma. This one was longer than the others, and it felt more personal. It was like she was having a conversation with me from beyond the grave. The note read, "Jake, if you're reading this, then you've proven that you're the kind of person I always hoped you become. You kept your promise about Barkley, even when everyone else thought you were crazy. You followed the clues, even when they didn't make sense. You trusted me, even when I couldn't explain why. This money isn't just about making you rich. It's about giving you the freedom to live your life on your own terms. Don't let anyone tell you what to do with it. Don't let them guilt you into sharing it with people who wouldn't have done the same for you. If you ever find yourself in real trouble, remember that you have everything you need. You have money, you have assets, and most importantly, you have integrity. That's worth more than all the cash in the world." The note was signed, "Love, Grandma," in her careful handwriting. There was also a postscript. "P.S. The property is paid off and the taxes are current. It's yours now." I sat in that basement for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. The property was mine too, That meant I owned not just the cash and coins, but also the land and buildings. It wasn't worth as much as the stock certificates, but it was another asset that no one in the family had known about. The research I did later confirmed that Grandma had never sold the Elm Street property. She'd been paying the taxes and maintenance costs for decades, keeping it as a secret investment. The property records showed that it had been transferred to a trust in 1991, the same year she'd established a trust for the stock certificates. Everything had been planned. The dog, the collar, the hidden notes, the safety deposit box, the secret property. It was all part of an elaborate system that Grandma had spent 30 years perfecting. She'd known that her death would cause a family fight over money, and she wanted to make sure that the person who truly cared about her wishes would be the one to benefit. Aunt Carol did try to appeal the court decision, but just like Mr. Martinez had predicted, she didn't have grounds for it. The appeals court upheld the original ruling, confirming that the trust was valid and that I had met all the conditions required to claim the assets. The property on Elm Street was officially transferred to my name, along with all the cash and coin that had been stored in the basement safe. The family's reaction was predictable. They stopped speaking to me entirely because I didn't share the money with anyone. Soon the family tried one more approach. They invited me to a family dinner at Aunt Carol's house, supposedly to work things out and heal the family rift. I knew it was really about trying to guilt me into dividing up the inheritance, so I declined. The invitation felt hollow anyway, like they were only interested in reconciling now that they knew exactly how much money was involved. Instead, I made a decision that I knew would honor Grandma's memory in the way she would have wanted. I bought a small farm outside of Kearney, about an hour's drive from Lincoln. It was 40 acres of rolling hills and pasture land, with an old farmhouse that needed some work but had good bones. I spent the next 6 months renovating the house and building additional structures on the property. The farm became Barkley's home, a sanctuary for senior dogs that had been abandoned or surrendered by their families. I partnered with local animal shelters to provide a peaceful place where older dogs could live out their remaining years with dignity and care. The property had enough space for dozens of dogs to run and play, and I hired a staff of veterinarians and caretakers who understood that these animals deserved love and attention regardless of their age. All those years, the family had thought Grandma had left me just a dog. They had seen Barkley as a burden, a consolation prize for the grandson who hadn't accomplished much with his life. But Grandma had left me something far more valuable than money. She had left me her trust. She had believed that I would keep my promises, follow through on my commitments, and use whatever resources she gave me to make the world a little bit better. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family had spent so much time arguing about money and inheritance that they had missed the real lesson Grandma was trying to teach. She hadn't hidden her fortune to be cruel or vindictive. She had created an elaborate test to make sure that her legacy would go to someone who understood the difference between having wealth and having character. Standing on the porch of the farmhouse, watching a dozen senior dogs chase each other through the evening light, I finally understood what Grandma had been planning all along. She had given me the tools to build something meaningful, something that would outlast both of us. Barkley's home wasn't just a sanctuary for abandoned dogs. It was proof that keeping your word to someone you love can lead to something beautiful.